There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing it all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that will lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of the comfort zone.
Welcome to the conversation. No doubt you, like everybody else I'm talking to, is looking for efficiency gains. I must hear it multiple times a day, every day of the week from everyone I'm talking about. And in a world of AI, perhaps it's time we really rethink what we mean by efficiency and learn to maximize the efficiency and, I would argue, effectiveness of the work that we can only do. So what do we know about how the brain works and how can we achieve this optimal effectiveness? That's what we're going to be talking about today with a brand new book called Hyperefficient, Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work. My guest is Dr. Mithu Storoni. She's a University Cambridge trained physician, a neuroscience researcher, and an ophthalmic surgeon. And she advises multinational corporations on mental health performance and stress management. And as I've said, the book is Hyperefficient. So Mithu, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to this. And I should say, so why does this topic matter to you, hyper-efficiency or hyper-efficient, especially in a world that's AI driven?
Well, the term efficiency and efficient has always been overused. And my motivation for writing this book was really a slight play on words, because I realized that in order to be really, really efficient with our brains, we needed a different approach to the approach we use with our hands. And when it comes to the brain, actually, in order to produce its best work, you actually have to be slightly inefficient, or you have to be slightly varied with the way you are working. And so if you want the brain to simply work faster and just produce piles of work which aren't of any great quality, you can do that efficiently. But if you want to produce work that's really, really excellent, really high quality, I call that being hyper efficient, because there your strategy has to be slightly different.
Okay, so in what ways different? You've mentioned things like I have to be inefficient and varied. So in what ways do I need to differ?
Right, so the muscle is very different from the mind, because when you're working with muscle, the faster you can make your muscle work, you can tell your muscle what to do. And when you stop working, your muscle stops working. So when you stop lifting something, when you rest, you know your body is resting. With the mind, it works in a very different way. It rests while it works, and it works while it rests. Also, when you are seeing an unending form of output from your mind, so if you're writing lots and lots of emails, or making a presentation very quickly, your output is very efficient, but actually your brain in its own mechanisms are working inefficiently. And the reason is that we know a few things. We know that the brain gets very tired if you make it work using sustained attention for over actually quite a short period of time. If it becomes inefficient, its output goes down. So the quality of your ideas, your ability to think creatively, solve problems, all of that goes down. So that's the first thing. The second thing we know is that if you make the brain work monotonously, it also starts becoming inefficient. So if you make it do the same kind of thing over and over again for long periods of time, it becomes inefficient. The third thing we know is that how you're working actually has a measurable effect on what you're producing. So a simple thing like if you're working in a cramped room or area, staring at a screen in a constant posture, if you compare how well you do if you were asked, say, come up with 10 ways to use a fork that you don't usually use a fork for instance, creative question. If you were to pose that question to someone who's, working in that cramped position, looking at a computer screen, tiny room, low ceiling, their answer will be significantly worse. They'll come up with fewer things than if someone were to be in an open space, they're allowed to sit comfortably, the ceiling is higher, and their posture is relaxed, where they're looking is relaxed. So the entire way you're working is influencing what your brain is doing. And these three things compound each other to produce what I term hyperefficiency.
Okay, so sustained attention is a problem. Monotony is a problem. And the work environment body posture is a problem. So anytime we'll come back to the details on this, but I'm spending too much time in sustained attention, too much monotony, or too cramped of a space in many ways, or cramped of my body position, I'm going to decrease efficiency, particularly for those activities that require mental capacity, thinking hard, solving problems, creative ideas. Yeah?
Correct. So you are, if you think of your brain as a sort of a very unique kind of machine, when it's working efficiently on its terms, not on our terms, not when we're looking at simply, the number of output it's producing, but in its terms, how well the information is passing from one point to another, how efficiently nerve signals are traveling across the brain. If you look at it, if you judge it from that perspective, then it becomes inefficient very quickly. And these are some of the things that make it inefficient. Of course, we haven't spoken about things like working with a very heavy load for a prolonged period of time, which causes fatigue, which also causes inefficiency. And that's something we are more or less aware of. But yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. So we need to talk about efficiency in a different way, because we're trying to make our brains produce complex output at a very fast, continual, steady state, but we're doing none of the things that actually make us efficient in that kind of environment where we're producing complex work, okay? And the brain is very different than other muscles in that it works when it's not working, and it works when, anyway, it's working at a different pace than the rest of our body, I think is the best way to say that one. Okay, I want to step back for some of the neuroscience for just a minute, and then we'll come back to some more tactics. But you talk about two brain functions, two different states. Why are these important to keep track of? Why do these matter in this whole equation?
So your brain is a very malleable organ, even though it's fixed in terms of its connections. It has its hard connections. It actually can change its state thanks to a very elaborate and clever network, which is regulated by the neuromodulator norepinephrine. And I describe two states because while you're working, if you just intuitively think about it, you will know that the kind of mental state you are in when you are reading a really difficult report or filing a really difficult report, or you're just having to get through it and really focus, that sort of mental state is very different from the kind of mental state you'd be in if you are just going through some ideas because you want to solve a creative problem, you want to design something, you're designing something for your startup, for your business. That sort of mental state is one that's kind of wandering, you want to have inspiration, you're thinking laterally, you're trying to nudge yourself into exploring the same problem through different angles. So these are two very distinct states of mind produced by the same brain within a space of seconds or moments. And this is an important thing to consider because when you're working in an office, you will go through at least three brain states. You will go through this mind-wandering gentle state, you will go through this state of high focus, and you'll also go through a state which is the state that many of us, I'd even say the majority of us, are in most of the time, which I call gear 3. And that state is where you are reacting, responding, acting quickly, working to deadlines, where your mind is working really fast. You can't sit back and solve a chess move, but you can absolutely finish your work to a deadline. Now, this third state is the state that I think we're in most of the time, But the kind of work we do in this third state, which is different from the creative work, it's different from the focused work, is the kind of work that AI is taking over quite quickly, relatively quickly, in of course to varying degrees in different industries. But the kind of work that AI is taking over is the kind of work that we do best when we are in that state of mind. And so if we want to flourish, and if we want to really, really get our place, preserve our place, and thrive as humans in this AI-dominated world, we have to be really good at doing what AI cannot do. And in order to be able to do that, we have to shift away from this Gear 3 state and back into what I call a Gear 2 state, the kind of mental state where your thinking is slower, but you can think laterally, you can solve problems, and you have very good focus. So we have engineered our workplaces to place us into Gear 3, inadvertently, without really being aware of it. Even coffee stands and espresso, stands, coffee houses in every city center, in every commercial district, amplify and enhance this mental state. But what we have to do now is we have to think about coming away from that state into these first two states, which are optimal for you to produce qualitatively good work. So the Gear 3 state is great for just getting through a pile of work. But in order to produce really good work, and also the kind of work that the human brain can only do, so the creative problem solving, innovative thinking, for you to be able to do that, you have to draw back into these Gear 1 and Gear 2 states.
This makes a lot of sense to me. So just to repeat, to make sure we're all clear on this one, is that you talk about 3 states, not 2. That 2 of them are uniquely our human contribution, if you will, the way we're going to have biggest impact in our organizations. I might argue the strategic space. One of them is a more focused, concentrating, drawing insights, interpreting, analyzing data. Okay, so that's what you call Gear 1. And the second one is the creative, lateral thinking, new ideas, strategic, we might say, in a corporate world, the wandering state, the speculative, what if, what might be. Those are the ones where we're going to add the greatest value as human beings in an AI-enabled world. But there is a Gear 3, which is just crank it out, get it done, move it, execute, where I'm not necessarily thinking deeply about it. I'm just running the tape, running in the maze, following the path, checking the I's, dotting the T's. And we've engineered our workspaces to let Gear 3 dominate. So coffee bars and so on. And if we're coming from an industrial age where what we were trying to drive in the industrial world was productivity, it makes sense that we engineered our work world for Gear 3. Now, you said coffee bars exacerbate the Gear 3. Explain.
Well, coffee bars actually, some people attribute the Industrial Revolution to coffee bars because when factory workers became tired and got very bored and really their work felt too much, coffee amplified or enhanced and accelerated their work. And so it really was a tool for the Industrial Revolution. So the reason why I mentioned coffee is simply because these 3 brain states are almost, this isn't exactly how it works, but it helps us imagine it. They are across a sort of a one-dimensional scale. So when your thoughts are slow, your mind is sort of soft and wandering, you're in Gear 1. Then when you can focus and you can do really good work, you're in Gear 2. At that point, you actually have faster thoughts, you have higher levels of norepinephrine in your brain. And if you go up from there onwards, you hit Gear 3. And how do we go up from there onwards? By taking anything that raises your norepinephrine. So whether it's coffee, whether it's noise, whether it's chaos, whether it's speed, whether it's your perception of time and things going faster, all of those things elevate your norepinephrine even more. And when that happens, we all know what an adrenaline-fueled state, what that term means. That also has an implication for your brain and the kind of state your brain adopts. So in that context, having coffee, especially too much coffee, not the odd cup, of course, can put you into that state. And whenever we notice ourselves falling from that state, so when we get the afternoon slump or when we have a lot to get to, we all know we reach for some form of caffeine to just take us over the hill. And again, that has the same effect, because when your brain is getting tired, your gear is going down, you're getting slower. And so having coffee or anything else pushes your gear back up by raising norepinephrine levels in your brain.
Okay, so coffee, sugar, vending machines, I might argue, noise levels, everybody around me, the cacophony of what's happening on the modern floor, working floor, the rush to meeting, all of those are exacerbating our gear 3, which is our brain is moving very fast. We can get things done, but we're not going to have the creative ideas or the real insights that comes from focus. All right. So gear 3s. All right. I get the concept here, and I like, this resonates with what I know from other researchers too about, like Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and thinking slow, that when you're in a fast mode, you're going around algorithms and likely to miss the details or miss some of the nuances that are going to sort of be the breakthrough places. So just as a kind of catch point. But I like the 3 states. I think that's a really interesting component. Okay, Mithu. So I buy that we need now to learn to create workplaces that are gear 1 and gear 2 friendly. And then I need to learn to shift my brain out of gear 3 so much and into gear 1 and gear 2. How?
So the first way is to go through the 3 things that I mentioned. So you have to cut down prolonged, sustained attention work. So you have to, ideally, if you can, work in a rhythmic way. So I propose working in a way that is around about 90 minutes long, 60 to 100 minutes, but around about 90 minutes long. Maximum. And within that time, you don't work at the same intensity. I propose working in what I refer to as a power law way. By that, what I mean is you work at your highest intensity, doing the most difficult work right at the start of that 90-minute slot. And then you pivot to lighter or easier work as that 90-minute block drags on. So if you visualize this, it would look like an inverse curve. So you have the highest point and then you quickly kind of drop down to the lowest point. So that is within a 90-minute bout. So I propose working these 90-minute cycles. And then within those 90-minute cycles, if what you're doing is really, really intense, you should still take breaks. So for instance, if you're doing something like working a math paper in an exam, studies have shown that when you're sitting an exam, taking a break that's as little, as short as, 5 seconds or 20 seconds or something, after each page that you've completed can actually improve your score.
Wow.
So that is a level of intensity I hope we don't encounter all the time. Most of us don't tend to encounter all the time. But when you're working with that sort of intensity, even taking a very, very short break, but a frequent break can help. So the bottom line here is introduce breaks to your work, but tailor those breaks for the intensity of the work you're doing. The harder your work, the more frequent your breaks should be. The length of each break isn't as important as the frequency. So it's more important to pause. It's not so important to pause for a very long time. So that's a general rule. So
it's an interesting, because when we think about taking a break, we think about getting up and walking around and chatting with somebody or getting another coffee or whatever. You're not talking about that kind of a break. You're talking about a very simple 5-second break. Give me an example.
So the important distinction here is within the 90 minutes and outside the 90 minutes. So when you're stopped, when you've done your 90-minute block of work, at that point I do recommend taking a proper 15 to 20-minute break, detachment, and so on. But within the 90-minute block, if you're working very, very intensely, than simply just closing your eyes and removing your focus away from your work. So just if you can't move from your desk and you have to get through your work, just closing your eyes immediately withdraws you into an alpha dominated kind of gear 1 state. So that sort of break is really to provide your brain with some relief when it's doing heavy lifting within those 90-minute bouts. But after each 90-minute block is over, at that point, you should give your brain a proper break for around 15 to 20 minutes or so.
And does that mean leave my area, or does that mean I just stop doing that kind of work for 15 minutes? What does a proper break look like after the 90-minute block?
So at the 90-minute block, at the end of those 90 minutes, you should just appraise your situation. So just consider how you're feeling. So for instance, if what you're doing was emotionally intense, so you're running towards a deadline and there's competition, there's some kind of threat, social status threat, think about how you're feeling emotionally. So if you're feeling emotionally really, really entangled in what you're just doing, then it's a good idea to, as a first step in that break, to do something that makes you completely forget about your work. So do something really, really immersive. Chatting to a colleague will remind you of work. So maybe it may not be the best thing to do. Leaving your office, leaving where you're working is one step. Doing something, as silly as just playing a computer game on your phone just for a few minutes, just to really forget where you are and throw yourself somewhere else. As soon as you do that, your mind can start resting. Because even if you've left the office chair, if your mind is still there, your rest break has not begun. So once you've carried out that sort of detachment, psychological detachment, at that point, it again depends on how you're feeling. So if you're feeling very wired, then doing something physical, so doing an active relaxation process, whether it's some stretches, whether it's taking a walk, whether it's even going for a quick run or a quick bout of exercise, depending on what you're used to doing, all of those are helpful. Now, if you imagine a second scenario where you're not emotionally involved at all, but what you were doing was mentally backbreaking. So as soon as you've stopped, it's just your mind just feels exhausted. At that point, doing nothing is the best kind of break to do. So sit down somewhere, ideally in nature, but it doesn't have to be. But just do not do anything. Don't think. Don't tax yourself through emotional triggers, through your phone, through the news or anything like that, or through gossip or anything like that. Just doing nothing lets your brain rest. So the kind of break you're doing should be tailored to the kind of work you are doing just before you start your break.
Okay. I have heard for a number of years that this 90-minute block is our maximum effectiveness with our brain, and that at about 90 minutes we need a break. What is striking me on this one, though, Mithu, is the sophistication with the kind of break and the pacing within even that 90 minutes. So if I replay what I've heard, when we have a 90-minute working cycle, that's what we want to aim for. And within that 90-minute working cycle, I'm going to have a period of high intensity and a period of not so high intensity. Highest intensity work at the very start of the 90-minute cycle when my brain is the freshest, and then I can expect that it will pivot to lighter. All right, within that 90-minute period, taking a small break, like a 5-second of closing my eyes, can elevate my performance, just because it gives my brain a moment to relax. All right? Now, after the 90 minutes, I now need a proper break. But the kind of proper break I need varies based on the work. So if I'm doing emotionally intense work, then I need a psychological detachment, which means doing something unrelated to work. Leaving the office, a computer game, coloring, art, anything that's unrelated to work. But if it's been really mentally taxing, like focused, concentrated, abstract thinking kind of work, not emotional, then what I need to do is nothing. Emptiness, no conversation, quiet. And both of those, I have to tailor it to what the kind of work I've been doing in order to let my brain rest.
That's a very good summary. Yes. I mean, the reason I mentioned that taking a rest within the 90-minute block is, again, it's tailoring your breaks to your intensity of work. So if you're doing something of, reasonably light intensity, you can probably carry on throughout those 90 minutes. But if you start off those 90 minutes doing something really, really intense, there is data to show that doing something that involves intense sustained attention for 20 minutes, for beyond 20 minutes, causes mental fatigue, which causes inefficiency of your brain's circuits and your kind of the information going around your brain. So it's really because of that. 20 minutes for intense sustained attention is a good boundary.
Right. You mentioned sitting a math exam, but this thing's about how many times have I heard from people that you're taking an exam, you're kind of in the middle of the exam and your brain just goes blank. You can't think of something that you know, but you walk out of the room, and then suddenly it comes to you. I think this is what you're talking about. This moment of break to let your brain rest so that things will come back to the surface. I find this really fascinating. And none of these people will often say to me, well, I don't have time for breaks. And I would argue that the breaks are what are going to give you time to do the high quality work, both the high quality and the time to do the work. So I think you need to think about, how do I keep myself as efficient as possible, as fresh as possible, as creative as possible along the way. It also reminds me of how many times I've heard from clients that, yes, I take a break. I walk between offices or between meetings, and I always take the stairs between the meetings, and I do this and I do that, and I do all these other things. Okay? And my comment to them is, well, what are you thinking about when you're taking the stairs? And inevitably I'm thinking about the last meeting I was just in, or the problem I haven't solved, or whatever. So you never really take this psychological detachment break that you're talking about.
Exactly. And, it's interesting when you mention your clients saying that there really isn't any time for a break, because this is exactly the kind of thinking we need to change. You see, if you are simply producing work like an assembly line, then yes, it's completely true that taking a break is going to impede your performance. But if you imagine you're a writer, as an example, you're a writer and you have to produce a 5,000 word article first thing in the morning, or within a day by the 5 p.m. deadline. Now, if you sit down to work in the morning, and writers have told me this, you sit down to work in the morning and you start typing and you hit your writer's block. And then you write things, but it just doesn't come out right. It doesn't sound right. So every 2 or 3 hours, you're deleting what you've just written. Or you keep what you've written and you give in a kind of a mediocre piece compared to what you can really produce at 5 p.m. So in that scenario, let's say 8 hours of work have resulted in 5,000, 10,000 words of a mediocre quality. But what you want to do instead is you want to sit down to work, you hit a writer's block, you take a walk, you do something else that'll nudge your creativity, you come back and it'll just flow. And writers have told me that it does indeed flow if they treat their work in this way. So what you're doing there is, rather than produce the mediocre quality work in 8 hours, you're going to produce exceptional work by your own standards within 2 hours. And of those 2 hours, half an hour may well have been sitting on a park bench, just thinking. So that's the way we have to start thinking about work as we pivot to the kind of work that AI cannot do.
I see this when people are working with, let's say, financial statements or spreadsheets, or checking for errors in a data set or an analysis, that if your brain is tired, you're going to miss things or make mistakes that you would not make if your brain was not tired. So if taking a break for 15 to 20 minutes means that you catch those errors faster, that is a gain. And I think that all of these are ways to just encourage. I think we also have to encourage managers that sometimes when somebody goes outside to sit on the park bench, it is not inefficiency. And sometimes when you're just staring off into space, it's not inefficiency. So we have to get a different mindset about how we watch people work as well. All right, what else in your mind can we do, Mithu, to increase our hyper-efficient brains?
So another thing we can tap into that is really stretching this, scaling it up to cover the entire day and your entire work day, is the idea that the brain, like the body, works has a circadian rhythm to it. So it works in a rhythmic way. We all have cycles within us. Our livers change shape over the 24 hours. Our brains change shape over the 24 hours. And what we know is that if you look at how the brain works, there are certain times of the day that are more optimal for doing certain kinds of work. And if you harness those intervals during the day, you can actually, at least potentially, really amplify and enhance the way you are doing that kind of work. So for instance, creative work seems to be enhanced first thing in the day. So if you're, living near the equator, then, around sunrise, and depending on the season, sunrise and sunset. So first thing in the day and last thing in the day. So the kind of time zone, the hours that would correspond to the sun rising and the sun setting. So these are the creative slots in the day. And focused attention work seems to become better as you move into the middle of the morning when the day is brighter, middle of the morning, right on into lunchtime. And then we all seem to have what's known as a post-lunch dip, where our alertness just drops for a little while immediately after lunchtime, whether or not we've had lunch, even though having lunch makes this dip worse. So if you take this, rather than if you're managing a large company and you have different departments or different sub-teams doing different things, rather than force all your team members to march in step to a, let's say, 9 to 7 workday, why not take the sub-teams working on something innovative or creative, maybe designing something, maybe researching something, take those members of your team and maybe invite them to come in earlier. So start, say, even as early as 7 o'clock in the morning. But as a trade-off for that, they get to have a break, or they get to have the hours that they don't need to work, or they don't need to be kind of optimal for. So the middle of the morning, lunchtime, early afternoon, perhaps they can have these hours off, or choose what they want to do during these hours. So doing this kind of little trade-off, in which case they can really be at work doing the kind of thing that their brain is most primed to be doing at the right time. If you compare that with taking the same team and saying, okay, start at 9, we'll have meetings for an hour, and then you can start doing your creative idea generation at around 10 o'clock for an hour, and then maybe immediately after lunch. So immediately after lunch, everyone will have their post-lunch dip, so their work will not be optimal. And in the middle of the morning, they will be in the mental state of being able to focus. So they may not be in this optimal mind-wandering state. So just doing that, and then you can, again, if you have a different sub-team who's working on implementing the design that your other sub-team has worked on, they need to focus. They need absolute full focus. So for them, they don't need to work during the creative hours. Perhaps tell them, okay, you can come in a little bit later, but we're going to block your middle morning to lunchtime, and we're going to block your middle afternoon to late afternoon. No meetings. Those are going to be protected times for you to focus. So in this way, you can really change the schedule for your teams or sub-teams, depending on what they're doing. And this can really help them to produce their own best work.
I see this mostly as being conscious of when we schedule meetings. So if I'm asking people to do strategic, creative, lateral thinking work, then I don't want to schedule meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning. I might want to schedule them later in the day, like at 10 o'clock. But being thoughtful about the work I'm asking my team to do and making sure that I've not filled the prime time slot with meetings. Seems like to me a very smart way of managing all of this. Okay, Mithu, time for one last tactic. Any last thing you recommend in terms of maximizing our efficiency of our brains for this Gear 1, Gear 2 work?
So there are one of the key things to remember is when you're working hard, you'll be in an optimal brain state. But if you work hard for too long, your brain will shift into this Gear 3 state. So just like coming up for air, the most important thing you can do is just to make sure you're aware that for multiple points during your day, you are withdrawing away from this hyper active, if you like, kind of output mode, and kind of going into the state of gentle daydreaming, of gentle thinking, and having as many intervals of that as possible during the day will enhance the quality of your work.
I love it. All right, Mithu, lots of insights on this one. So my guest is Dr. Mithu Storoni. The book we've been talking about is Hyperefficient: Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work. I think what is most insightful to me is this recognition of this dichotomy, if you will, between slow and fast in terms of how our brains work, and 3 gears that you talk about as we move along this dichotomy. One where I'm slow and being creative, one where I'm a little bit faster but being focused, insight-driven, and one where I'm being super fast, execute, algorithmic driven. And that it's the intentional shifting of our brains to go into Gear 1 and Gear 2 that are going to make us add the greatest value and work most efficiently with our AI technology at the end of the day. And those are the places we're asking our senior leaders to step into in terms of creative thinking, in terms of solving problems, in terms of strategic insight. But there's an intentionality in the way that we think about sustained attention, the blocks in which we work, the kind of breaks we take, the ways in which we take those breaks, and the environment that we put ourselves in that allow us to shift from the Gear 3 super fast execute into the Gear 1, Gear 2 more strategic, more impactful work. And that, I think, is a super insight. So Mithu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Likewise. And please join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone. And also check out our brand new website, outofthecomfortzone.com. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in for another edition next week with Dr. Wanda Wallace on the Voice America Business Channel. Reach outside your comfort zone this week.